America, 1803, a vast unknown continent. Thomas Jefferson, now the third President of the United States of America, finally has the opportunity to complete one of his lifelong dreams, sending explorers west. With a $2,500 grant from Congress centered around building relations with Native Americans and finding a route by water to the Pacific, all Jefferson had to do now was find the right individuals for the journey. Meriwether Lewis was born on August 18th of 1774 to William Lewis and Lucy Meriwether. He spent his formative years exploring the wilderness surrounding his family's Virginian plantation, learning to hunt, navigate, and to thrive in the outdoors. At the age of 20, Lewis joined the Virginia militia and worked to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. Just a year later, he joined the United States Army and served as a part of William Clark's chosen rifle team during the Northwest Indian War. In 1801, Lewis was asked by his childhood neighbor, Thomas Jefferson, to be his personal secretary. His knowledge pertaining to the Western Territories and extensive military experience made Lewis a prime candidate over other members of the Lewis family. After 2 years of serving under Jefferson, he was offered the opportunity of a lifetime to command an expedition westward. He was then made commander of the Corps of Discovery and tasked with gathering other qualified men. Among his top choices was Lieutenant Clark. Born on August 1st of 1770 to parents John and Anne Clark, Clark was the ninth of 10 children. Spending his primary years on his family's Virginian plantation, he received no formal education, and instead spent his time learning practical survival skills. Following in the footsteps of his oldest brother, George Clark, William decided to join the military at the ripe age of 19, and by age 22 had already become a lieutenant. Upon the death of his father in 1799, Clark inherited more than 3,300 acres, 23 slaves, a gristmill, and a distillery. Unfortunately, his good fortune did not last very long. His family's finances forced him to sell the farm, putting his future in jeopardy. It only makes sense when an old-time Army friend, Meriwether Lewis, asked him to join as co-leader of a revolutionary exploration west. Clark did not hesitate to agree. The two men had many preparations for the perilous journey ahead. In 1803, Lewis traveled to Philadelphia to be taught by experts of their respective fields. Benjamin Rush taught him medicine, Caspar Wister taught him anatomy and fossils. He also learned mathematics from Robert Patterson, botany from Benjamin Smith Barton, and from Andrew Ellicott, he learned the crucial skill of cartography and surveying. While in Philadelphia, Lewis also picked up rifles and other crucial supplies from Harper's Ferry that he then shipped off to Pittsburgh. The explorers' supply list was extensive, as they weren't sure how long their journey would take. For survival equipment, they took camping supplies such as oilcloths, steel flints, utensils, corn mill, mosquito netting, fishing equipment, clothing, weapons such as the Harper's Ferry model rifle of 1803, the contract rifle, and the contract small rifle, as well as bountiful ammunition. In addition to these rifles brought for the Corps, Clark also brought his own small rifle. This weapon was lethal up to 120 feet. To aid in completing the task given to them by Jefferson, they brought books on botany, geography, astronomy, as well as maps and an extensive list of surveying instruments. This included compasses, quadrants, telescopes, sextants, and a chronometer. In the winter of 1803 and 1804, Lewis wasn't satisfied with the number of quality hunters within the Corps. To overcome this, the only option they had was to train the current volunteers. To address this problem, George Drulard, an experienced hunter and marksman, was placed in charge of creating a rigorous training curriculum that covered a variety of wilderness survival skills that included marksmanship, rudimentary first aid, and butchering. Additionally, trainees were also taught distinctions among wildlife species, geographical and seasonal factors, in addition to woodsmanship. Throughout this training, the Corps saw continuous improvement, as its members went from volunteers and soldiers to frontiermen capable of surviving for months on end in the backcountry. Finally, in 1804, the expedition group headed west. The group consisted of 43 people, 27 of which were soldiers, a contracted boat crew, Lewis, Clark, and Clark's slave, York. They traveled up the Missouri River on two small pirogues and Lewis's 55-foot keelboat. The boats moved slowly, only traveling about 10 to 15 miles on average per day. The voyage up the river was not easy. They fought heat, strong currents, swarms of insects, and disease. The first and only crew member to die was Sergeant Charles Floyd, who succumbed to appendicitis. By July 4th, the group had managed to venture just west of the Mississippi. This was the first time someone observed Independence Day this far west. It was celebrated with extra whiskey and a firing of Discovery's cannon. On June 25, 1804, about 2 months after the expeditionary force had left Camp River du Bois, 2 wolves were spotted by the mouth of a Kansas river by a hunter. Here he managed to shoot and kill only one of them. The very next day, Joseph and Reuben Field managed to capture a cub and tried to keep it as a pet, but only after 3 days the cub managed to escape after chewing through its bonds. The expedition continued to move northwest, eventually reaching Omaha Valley, Nebraska by early August. Clark, in charge of negotiations with the Indian tribes, set up a council with the natives in the area to establish relations. They handed out items such as peace medals, American flags, and presented modern technology. They also tried to establish win-win trade relations. The expedition continued northward, eventually reaching the Yankton Sticks in South Dakota. These peace talks went well, with the Yanktons agreeing to send out representatives to speak with President Jefferson in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, not all encounters with the natives went this well. As the expedition carried on upward through South Dakota, they had a run-in with the Lakota people. Otherwise known as Texan Sticks, the Lakota demanded one of the boats as a fee for the crew to continue upriver. Coming close to a fight, another chief eventually stepped in, and the expedition crew left rather dramatically just a few days later. On August 27, 1804, while the group was traveling near what is now Yankton, South Dakota, the youngest of the Odyssey, George Shannon, was sent off in search for lost horses. While scouting for the horses, Shannon had become turned around. Believing that the group had passed him, he continued ferociously forward in an attempt to catch up to them. Eventually he gave up, and in defeat he turned around and started heading back to St. Louis. After doing so, he reunited with the group after 12 days of being alone in the wilderness. On September 7, 1804, while in Boyd County, Nebraska, the expedition discovered prairie dogs. In his journal, Clark described them as a village of small animals that contain great numbers of holes on top, which these little animals sit erect, make a whistling noise, and when alarmed, step into their hole. The group then decided to attempt to capture one of these animals. After failing to dig them out of the tunnels, the group managed to capture one by flushing it out. Just 1 week later, while the group was in what is now Chamberlain, South Dakota, a hunter successfully killed a rabbit that possessed large ears. The men saw these ears and thought they were similar to a donkey, so they called the animal the jackass rabbit. Later on, the name was shortened to Jack Rabbit. On the same day, while close to Ball Creek, Clark successfully shot his first pronghorn. At that time, they called it a buckgoat. This animal was repeatedly seen throughout their time spent in the Great Plains and the greater western area. The expedition successfully spotted and killed its first coyote on September 18, 1804. Originally called the prairie wolf, these animals could be heard on most nights howling by the group.
On October 24th, the group finally arrived at the villages of Mandan and Hidatsa, built along the Missouri River in central Dakota. Lewis and Clark decided it would be best to build their winter fort, Fort Mandan, across the river from the main village. The expedition came across French-Canadian trapper Toussaint Charbonneau, who is an interpreter for the Hidatsa. The expedition chose to hire him not only for his interpreting skills, but for his wife, Sacagawea. While Sacagawea was originally brought because of her ability to speak Shoshone, she ended up leading the group throughout much of their journey in the Western Plains. She was originally a Shoshone Indian who had been sold to Charbonneau after being captured by the Hudatas. The party finally finished building Fort Mandan on December 17th. As in the words of Clark, a very cold morning. The thermometer stood at 43 degrees below zero.
On April 7th of 1805, the Corps of Discovery split and each part headed out in different directions from Fort Mandan. The first party, headed by Corporal Richard Worthington, was in charge of bringing important cargo back to President Jefferson. This included 4 large boxes and 1 trunk. The trunk was filled with goods from the Mandan people, such as a bow with arrows, an earthen pot, native tobacco seeds, articles of clothing, buffalo robes, and an ear of corn. 1 box contained scientific discoveries such as 60 pressed plant specimens and 67 samples of earth, salts, and minerals. Another box held evidence of local animals containing skins and skeletons of antelope, jackrabbits, badgers, a coyote, a grizzly bear, and 12 red foxes. On the trip, they also sent live animals back, including a prairie dog, a sharp-tailed grouse, and 4 magpies. Clark sent back a map that he made of Missouri to the Mandan village to Henry Dearborn, the Secretary of War at the time. The final item sent back by the captains was a chart containing all the information they had collected of the 53 Native American tribes. Later that month, while in Montana, Lewis and a volunteer encountered a never-yet-recorded grizzly bear. Despite only hearing Indian accounts of how fearsome these bears could be, Lewis thought that their guns would render them no enemy. However, for the next several weeks, the men sent out hunting continuously encountered grizzly bears that proved themselves to be extremely difficult to kill. The expedition ended up partially doubling back, having to take a river northeast. The captains named this river after Sacagawea, following a tradition of naming each new landmark after every member of the expedition. On June 13th, while scouting ahead of the party, Lewis discovered the Great Falls of Missouri. This would prove to be a barrier for the expedition. The captains initially thought getting around the falls in rough terrain would take around half a day. Instead, weather conditions and physical obstacles halted the crew for a full month. After another month, the crew reached a literal fork in the road. The 3 forks in the river were named Gallatin, the Madison, and the Jefferson, respectively. The 2 captains chose to continue down the southernmost fork, believing that water transparency and information given by the Indians to determine which one was the Missouri. Lewis, after scouting ahead of the rest of the expedition across the Continental Divide, was met with disappointment. Instead of finding a northwest passage, as was the expedition's goal, all he found was more land. This disappointment was met with more hardship. Later that August, the group had to traverse through Bitterroot Mountains, which had scarce game to hunt and rough terrain. With the men burning around 5,000 calories on a normal day, these extremely hard days of travel saw themselves burning around 15,000 calories. That meant it required, in the words of Clark himself, 4 deer, or an elk, and a deer, or 1 buffalo to supply us for 24 hours. This meant that the party always had people dedicated to hunting. And yet, throughout their entire time crossing the Bitterroot Mountains, they only caught 1 deer. With provisions exhausted and no game in sight, the expedition was on the brink of starvation when they found better lands. Continuing to follow the Missouri to its source, the men eventually arrived at Traveler's Rest. In preparation for another mountain crossing, it was at this point they were informed by the natives that 51 days of their journey was for nothing, as they had missed an important shortcut in their dedication to the Missouri River. The group headed back into the Bitterroot Mountains once again, but this time with a local guide. The group lost the trail across the steep and heavily forested mountains, leaving them once again starving and eventually leading to the death of 1 man. Continuing their journey across Montana, the expedition crew finally had some good luck. After acquiring 5 new canoes from the natives, they launched onto the Clearwater River, and for the first time since leaving St. Louis, they had the current at their backs and smooth sailing. They journeyed down the Clearwater River and then the Snake River before reaching the Great Columbia River in October. Along this river, they came across a number of previously unknown and unnamed native tribes. On November 7, 1805, Clark writes, "Great joined the camp. We are in view of the ocean, this great Pacific Ocean, which we've been so long anxious to see, and the roaring noise made by the waves breaking on the rocky shores may be heard distinctly." The expedition believed that they had found the ocean, but were instead in the Columbia estuary, still another 20 miles from the sea. The crew were stuck here for 3 weeks before eventually journeying on to Fort Clatsop, between Washington and Oregon. To address this issue, the expedition sent out a detachment of 5 men in search of a good place to make salt. The detachment quickly found a suitable salt collection site in a matter of several days and got to work soon after. And after a few days, they discovered that they could produce up to 1 gallon of salt per day. When the detachment finally abandoned their post on February 20th, they produced an incredible 28 gallons of salt. This lasted them well into March. They spent winter here from December to March. When the crew left to head back east, they left the fort to the Clatsop Indians. They headed back the way they came, crossing the Bitterroot Mountains. The group once again split in Idaho to explore the lesser-known parts of the country more thoroughly. On their way back, the expedition suffered more casualties. Lewis's detachment killed Blackfoot natives attempting to take horses. Another incident occurred when Private Purrier Crizot shot Lewis in the leg after mistaking him for an elk. By the time Lewis and Clark reunited along the Missouri River in North Dakota, Lewis's leg had almost healed, and together they returned to St. Louis in celebration. Throughout the Corps' odyssey, several animals were consistently ran across. One of the most common animals was deer. From mule deer to cottontails, a wide variety of deer species was spotted on their journey. Elk were also a common animal that the group came across while exploring. This was reflected in the fact that 375 of them were killed in total by the group. By far the most elk were killed at and around Fort Clatsop, as the lack of salt and warm weather caused their food to spoil abnormally fast. Another common animal the group ran across were buffaloes. At first, this wasn't the case, as the eastward herds near and around St. Louis had been killed off. Despite this, the first bison the group came across was on June 28, 1804, near the Kansas River. As the expedition continued westward from Missouri to South Dakota, the herd steadily increased in size. One of the largest herds the group came across totaled an estimated 3,000 bison. In total, the trip took 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days to finish, which came out to a total of approximately 862 days. Throughout their journey, they killed at minimum 1,001 deer, 35 elk, 227 bison, 62 pronghorns, 113 beavers, 104 geese and brant, 48 shorebirds, 46 grouse, 45 ducks and coots, 9 turkeys, 43 grizzly bears, 23 black bears, 36 wolves, and 16 otters. Along with this, they consumed a total of 193 pounds of soup, 11 bags of hulled corn, 30 half barrels of flour, 1 keg of hog's lard, 1 bag of coffee, and 2 bags of sugar. This came out to a total of about 7 tons of their food supply. Throughout their journey, Lewis discovered over 300 types of plants, including tobacco, flowers, grasses, trees, and herbs. In addition to that, Lewis also made numerous scientific discoveries throughout his expedition. Along their journey, the expedition came across 50 previously undiscovered Native American tribes. The primary tribes included the Shoshone tribe, from which Sacagawea was from. Sacagawea led the Corps discovery through the Western Plains while caring for her husband and newborn child. The Hidatsa tribe, a gun-wielding tribe that kidnapped Sacagawea while she was young, and also worked and traded with the expedition members. The Mandan and Minitari, a friendly tribe that aided the expedition through the first winter. The Blackfeet, a tribe that was unwelcoming to white folk, broken up into 3 sections: the Sikseki, the Nani, and the Piikani Chinook, lived on the northern side of the Columbia River estuary, which had been trading with Europeans for over a decade. And the Styx tribe. Hostile to the expedition, they attempted to block the party's movement upriver, but were quickly dissuaded from their hostilities by the arms the Corps carried. Along their journey, Lewis collected a variety of gifts from the Native Americans. These included bread, face paint, knives, tobacco, ivory, combs, bright cloth, ribbons, sewing notions, and mirrors. Over the course of the journey, Lewis and Clark made 83 maps. These were primarily made by Clark and were mostly compass traverse maps. These maps helped provide images to areas previously undrawn and helped correct misconceptions about the West. Despite Lewis and Clark's failure to find a passage by water west, they were celebrated for their voyage. Upon their return to St. Louis, they were honored with a grand ball and dinner. Thanks to their hard work, Lewis was appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory and received a captain's pay of $2,776.22, and Clark received a lieutenant's pay of $2,113.74. Both of them also received 1,600 acres of land. Clark was eventually made head of Indian Affairs in St. Louis. He spent his life building policies surrounding and protecting Indian interests, though he was not so successful. Meriwether Lewis died in 1809 at the young age of 35 to gunshot wounds. It is a widely debated topic on whether or not he took his own life or was murdered. William Clark, on the other hand, lived a full life before dying at the age of 69 in 1838 of natural causes. These men and women that went on the journey west made their mark on our history, and it will continue to be taught generation after generation as an opener to Western development.